Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Asian Carp Canada webinar. This webinar will focus on Asian carp's enforcement activities, approaches across Great Lakes jurisdictions. My name is Rebecca Schroeder, and I work on the Asian Carp program as a project coordinator at the Invasive Species Center. Today I am pleased to introduce you to our speaker, Brenda Koenig from the Enforcement Branch of the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And today just so happens to be her birthday, so happy birthday, Brenda. Brenda tried to be an invasive species over her academic and career years, with forays into habitats in the Canadian Arctic and Jamaica, but she kept migrating back to the locale she is Indigenous to, Peterborough, Ontario. After years of exploring borderland fish habitat along Ontario's highways as an environmental consultant, she joined the Ministry of Natural Resources in 2004. Her first job in Fisheries Policy section was focused on fisheries management planning. This evolved to leading the provincial review of bait policy. The dark side beckoned and she joined the Enforcement Branch in 2013. Her current portfolio as a provincial enforcement specialist includes fisheries and invasive species. So just before I pass it over to Brenda, I want to point out a couple of things. If at any time you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them in the question box and Brenda will answer them throughout or following the webinar. And also this webinar will be available online tomorrow on our website, www.asiancarp.ca. So with that, Brenda, I'll let you take over from here.
All right, thank you very much, Rebecca, and I hope everybody can hear me all right. Trying to figure out, oh yes, I have to click on here, sorry. There we go. All right, so I'm very happy to be able to do this webinar today. Just by way of introduction, the presentation today was a presentation that I did at the International Conference on Aquatic Invasive Species in October down in Fort Lauderdale. And I would like to, at this point in time, gratefully acknowledge the support of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission in attending that, where this slide deck was presented on behalf of the Law Committee. So I'll get into the general structure in the next few slides of the Law Committee and how the Great Lakes Fishery Commission ties into that. But before we get started, I also wanted to acknowledge my co-presenters who worked to help develop this presentation. Terry Short is a second lieutenant from Michigan. He's been the past chair of the Law Enforcement Committee. Jill Wingfield is a communication specialist from the Secretariat at the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. And Kevin Ramsey is an enforcement specialist that works for the Secretariat as well. So just a bit of an outline of what I'm hoping to cover here today. I'd like to give you a little bit of background that explains the context in terms of the Law Committee and the work that we are doing collectively to represent the jurisdictions around the Great Lakes. Part of the presentation is a little bit of a regulatory overview, so what the rules are surrounding Asian carps in those jurisdictions and how that relates also to some federal legislation. A little bit of time spent talking about what our future work is in terms of promoting compliance at the hind end of the presentation. There's also some examples, selected examples of work that is being done in some jurisdictions around Asian carp enforcement and where we're going forward with the influence model that we've been using and some accomplishments that have been recognized in the past. So just to set some context, most of you are aware the Great Lakes fishery is an important economic factor. The Great Lakes commercial and recreational and also the tribal fisheries collectively are valued at more than $7 billion annually and support approximately 75,000 jobs. So the significant economic factor associated with the fishery. If you look at some of the statistics on this chart as well by the numbers, you can see that there's 177 fish species that currently exist in the Great Lakes or in the tributaries themselves. 139 of these are native fish species, 34 of them are known to be non-native fish species, and 4 are of undetermined origin. And significantly, 61 of these fish species that are native are considered to be threatened or endangered, and 18 extirpated or extinct from at least one Great Lake. So to set the context of the Great Lakes Law Enforcement Committee, there is a flow chart pictured here, but the takeaway is about the reporting structure that we have and also the membership that we have. So seeing the need for formalized cooperation, the fish chiefs that are seated on the Council of the Great Lakes Fishery Agencies, so that's under the, you see the second box, the Council of Great Lakes Fish Agencies developed the Joint Strategic Plan, and this plan specifies the structure through which basin-wide fishery management decisions are accomplished. The Council of Lake Committees, which is comprised of senior-level fishery managers, receives technical input from the lake committees, also from the Law Enforcement Committee and Fish Health Committees, and bases the management decisions on this information. And how does the Great Lakes Fishery Commission Secretary fit into this? The Secretariat basically functions to support all of these individual groups. So in terms of membership of the Law Enforcement Committee, this map basically outlines who is part of the committee. So you can see that the Great Lakes jurisdictions include the 8 states. There's also 2 tribal groups that are involved, and the 1 province, being Ontario. We have enforcement responsibilities in the basin. In addition to those agencies that have direct links to enforcement, there are also a number of other agencies that have management responsibilities. So we also have the involvement of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and also the Fish and Wildlife Service from the United States. One of the things that was recognized early on is that the basin really can only be as protected as the weakest regulation that exists in that jurisdiction, because people who are looking to break the laws will simply move to another jurisdiction to carry out their activities. That's something that, you know, has been foremost in terms of looking for consistency of rules and regulations across the jurisdictions, and I'll speak to this in subsequent slides. So our mission statement for the Law Committee, which we refer to as LAW for short, is listed up here at the top. It's really to protect, enhance, and promote safe and wide use of the natural resource in the Great Lakes for not only present but future generations as well. The committee functions to serve as a conduit for the transfer of information between fisheries managers, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, and also law enforcement agencies to design and implement enforceable regulations. So it's a forum for information sharing. It's also a place where different jurisdictions can support each other, not only in terms of law enforcement support, but also support for fisheries management. And one of the other things that happens as a matter of what the committee does is that we make recommendations to the Council of Lake Committees. So we provide enforcement information that has implications for fisheries management. Some of these may include cooperative procedures where we're working together. It's also speaking to making sure that when policies and rules are made, they're both practical and things that can be enforced on the ground. And the last point is an important one. It's a key one here. If you think about what we said before, that, you know, the protection of the basin is really only as strong as the weakest link. So one of the things that we focus on is looking for consistent regulations. So it doesn't mean that the regulations or the rules need to be the same, but the objectives need to be similar. So we don't have people simply moving to other jurisdictions where an activity that is banned in one area may be allowed in this other area. So I put this slide up. I went onto EdMaps before I developed this presentation for the ICASE presentation in October, and just had a look at the number of occurrences of Asian carp that are recorded in the EdMaps database. And part of the reason for that is simply to illustrate that Ontario's situation has changed a little bit in the last few years because we now have a number of detections of grass carp. So if you look in the map in the lower right corner, you can see that there's been 26 occurrences that have been associated with them being found in Ontario. The rest of the picture for the other Asian carp species, of course, is that there aren't any recorded occurrences of the other black carp, silver carp, or big head carp. Those, of course, are centered in the states, in those jurisdictions. Particularly if you look at silver carp, you see quite a high number of them around the state of Illinois. And also if you look at big head carp, there's quite a high number of detections, 85 around Illinois. So this is a key part of the story that's going to unfold in the slide deck because really part of the focus of our influence model in terms of trying to negotiate getting stronger regulations or rules was around protecting Ontario and Canada from the spread of Asian carp into our areas. So this slide shows a chronology of the rules as they pertain to Asian carp for essentially the jurisdictions that are involved in the law committee, the Great Lakes jurisdictions. So you'll see that the point of this slide really is was to show that during the period from 2002 to 2006, there was a number of activities that occurred, and I know we've moved on to the next slide, but that's okay. I just want to verbally describe this to you. Asian carp were becoming a real focus of conversations and of there was a strong effort by the Law Enforcement Committee and the Council of Lakes Committee to continually push for regulations under the Lacey Act, specifically the injurious species listing. The states in the basin were really able to speak more effectively on a national scale to encourage the Lacey Act listings, and you'll see the timeline slide again in a few slides, but in the later years of the 2000s, starting in 2007, the three species, black carp, silver carp, and big head carp, were listed on the injurious list. So why is that significant? It's significant because the independent jurisdictions really thought there needed to be a consistent approach that would stop the movement of injurious species under the Lacey Act amongst the different jurisdictions. And you can see, if you look at Injurious Wildlife Provision Title 18, which is pictured on the slide now, under the Lacey Act, this functions to prevent the importation into the U.S. or any territory of the U.S. It also has a clause in there that has been understood to mean that shipment between the continental U.S. and any of the states or the District of Columbia, Hawaii, or Commonwealth of Puerto Rico was prohibited. That's really the gist of it, and that has been the interpretation until a little while ago. So what's happened is that in 2017, there was a decision that was handed down where the interpretation has changed. So the Lacey Act injurious species listing and Clause 18 ruled that it does not prohibit interstate transport. And the explanation really comes from a challenge that the U.S. Association of Reptile Keepers raised. And they maintained that because of the grammatical structure of the statute, it actually did not apply to movement between states. This challenge was upheld. It really speaks to the fact of how important a word can be. If the word was among, it would have been probably a different interpretation. So this has been upheld through case law, that this prohibition does no longer apply to between state movement. And what does that mean for the various jurisdictions? It really means that if you look at this timeline, again, during the time when there was the push for the Lacey Act listing of injurious species to include Asian carp, the independent jurisdictions around the Great Lakes were working to have prohibitions put in place on various activities. And what you see here in this chart is a summary, essentially, of what that looks like now. So during that time when we were pushing for federal legislation to address the movement of species like black carp, silver, and bighead carp, the independent jurisdictions were working on their own laws. And so if you look at this chart, the take-home message is that for those three species, silver, black, and bighead, almost all jurisdictions ban most of the activities. So we're talking about sale, possession, transport, all those activities are banned. You can see that in the blue boxes. There are some exceptions for grass carp, and the focus here isn't so much on the individual approach, but the fact that collectively all the jurisdictions work to have their own rules in place, which really is the saving grace, because case law can change the interpretation of things at any time. So what's been going on in terms of Asian carp enforcement across the Great Lakes jurisdictions? Just using this slide as a bit of a segue into that, this is a sort of general compliance model. It's a slide that we use within the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry frequently, just to illustrate that enforcement isn't an activity that's solely attributed to people who have powers and authorities. There is the left-hand end of the spectrum where we have people involved who not only may our officers do this, people who have authorities, but also people who are working with policy sections or program areas, frontline biologists, all work to spread information about the rules that are in place, and may actually have some limited ability to perform all the way up to inspection generally. It depends on the way the statute is set up or the rule is set up. But essentially, the message is that we're all working together to try to promote compliance to the rules. And the spectrum is a little bit important in terms of the activities that I'm going to highlight from some of the selected jurisdictions. Just as an example, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the state of Ohio has done in terms of preventing the movement of aquatic invasive species. This was focused in on the bait trade, and specifically one of their prongs of approach was to look at pathways for Asian carp. So they recognized that a pathway of spread of Asian carp, of course, may be through the transfer of live fish via the bait trade. And in fact, the work in Ohio was loosely based on some work that had been already started in Ontario. Ohio has done not only surveillance of live bait, so monitoring the live bait for the presence of non-target species such as Asian carp and or other invasive species, looking at the retail level to do inspections of outlets to make sure that any non-target species are not being transferred to people who are buying them and ultimately potentially being dumped into water bodies by people who release their unused bait rather than dispose of it in the garbage. The other aspect included education, so they were providing bait outlets with material that outlines the rules and also a guide for identifying aquatic invasive species that you might encounter in the bait trade. And the other part of this was, of course, outreach. So on that left end of the compliance spectrum, implementation of handing out materials to the public that really speaks to anglers not to participate in a practice that could introduce invasive species into public water bodies. And you'll see at the bottom of the slide here, this is one of their promotional items that they were using. So crash unused bait, help stop invasive species, pretty simple message. They've also included some messaging in there, clean, drain, dry, which would be speaking to recreational boaters and anglers who may be using boats to go from one water body to another. Ohio spent a fair bit of time developing a little booklet. It's Quick ID Features for Bait Fish. This is a really nice little booklet. It sort of fits in your hand quite well, something that you could throw into a tackle box. It has some waterproofing on it as well. But what the book sets out to do really is to help anglers identify which species are legal for use and appropriate for use, and also alerts them to the fact that they need to be looking out for species that shouldn't be in their bait bucket. So you'll see from some of the screen captures that are pictured on this slide that some of the pages speak to the identification of invasive species that are in their juvenile forms. That may look like a bait species that you could potentially use lawfully. So you'll see the comparison there for silver carp, big head carp, and golden shiner, and some of the similarities that are outlined there. So what did Ohio find? Ohio's being very transparent in what they found. If you go onto their webpage, you can see the results of the work that they did. And I've just got a bit of a summary here right now. So in 2014, they inspected 44 bait dealers, which represents 8% of the total bait dealers in the state. They found 16 violations and 1 mosquito fish. So one fish was not considered a bait species. One of the things they recognized is that the training would obviously, in terms of helping people identify bait fish, pay off, and not only their staff, but they purchased equipment and educational materials for bait dealers were distributed. So there was material that was sent out to sort of help with that aspect of making sure people knew what the rules are and that they could identify fish that could legally be used. So they went back again in 2015 and did a much larger number of inspections that represented 83% of the 8 dealers. So they did 463 inspections, and the numbers changed a little bit. So they found 78 violations. 5 parties were handed summonses, and 73 received warnings. Significantly, they found that some of the bait came from as far away as Arkansas, which is a large producer of bait fish. We know from information in Ontario that just in terms of our policy review that Arkansas is a large producer. They also found bait from Minnesota, Texas, and Wisconsin. But the summary of this really is that they did not feel that aquatic invaders were prevalent in the bait. So 4 invasive fish over a total of 507 inspections. And the conclusion being that they feel the bait industry is better educated about their awareness of aquatic invasive species that might be contained in the bait and the rules that are in place to stop the spread. So what has Ontario done? This is as a selected example. Ontario has been working to essentially try to stop the spread of Asian carp through pathways at border crossings and food fish markets. Until recently, the rule in Ontario in terms of possession of Asian carp was that you couldn't possess them live, you had to possess them dead. And you wouldn't think there would be much confusion about that, but that actually has led to an amendment of some of the rules in Ontario. So one of the practices that was prevalent was that live fish haulers were bringing Asian carp up from the States in water, and when they arrived at the border, they would drain the water out of the holding tanks. And it was discovered that because they're usually traveling in very cold water, the fish metabolism is reduced. Some of those fish could be surviving without water for up to 48 hours. And really, this is part of what led to the push to have an amendment made that says, you know, you can't import Asian carp or possess them unless they are dead and eviscerated. So we're making sure they're really dead.
Dead.
Dead. So enforcement branch in Ontario, from our perspective, our regulatory framework, we put quite a bit of effort towards outreach, investigations, and enforcement during those early years before we had the change in the regulation. So you can see from the number of hours that were devoted, quite a large chunk of hours starting in 2010 and starts to dwindle off in 2013. And some people question why there's that drop in the hours that were devoted. Really, it's because so much time was spent getting messaging out that it was felt that spot checks could be reduced in terms of the number of hours. So you see them dropping by about half from 2012 to 2013. And really where that comes from is the fact that there was a lot of time spent educating people and also making them aware. And the deterrence factor may have had something to do with it as well. So the deterrence factor, if you look at what we have in terms of convictions in Ontario between 2005 and 2013, 20 convictions on 14 different entities, so 14 different companies. All within the Greater Toronto area, we see that there was up to $105,000 in fines. We split that out to look at, you know, what kinds of fines were coming from border work inspections, and a good chunk of change there, $235,000 in fines. And what did we stop from coming into the province? Quite a lot of fish, just over 40,000 Asian carp, pounds of Asian carp stopped from coming into the province. One of the other things that took place over this time period is that an Asian carp task team was formed, and there was also some joint forces operations between the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and the Canadian Border Services Agency. So some partnership approaches to enforcement. Those were the selected examples of enforcement approaches. I'd like to just switch a little bit right now to some of the activities that the Law Enforcement Committee has been working on in terms of promoting compliance with aquatic invasive species rules and the management approaches to that. So the committee has been quite active in terms of this year. We partnered with the Conference of Great Lakes and St. Lawrence governors and premiers to work on a resolution to improve regional law enforcement capabilities around aquatic invasive species. So our committee met with the conference representatives in March of 2017 and devoted quite a chunk of our agenda to those discussions. I think we spent 3 hours at the biannual law meetings that we held in Ypsilanti to talk about how we could move forward. And we continue to provide input during the summer as well. Initially, those early discussions were around the potential to use an existing tool that works in the United States, the Violators Compact, where you can Somebody who, for example, has lost their ability to hunt or fish in one jurisdiction may subsequently be prohibited from hunting or fishing in another jurisdiction that recognizes that. And we realized that model wouldn't necessarily work very well for aquatic invasive species, primarily because it didn't recognize commercial activities, and also because I think there have been some challenges associated with implementing that in the States. So we did work with the conference over the summer, and also with our policy and program areas in those jurisdictions where enforcement is sort of a bit more separated from policy and management focuses. What we've ended up with is what's pictured here. There was a news release that came out October 20th, and it was an announcement that the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence governors and premiers basically released, speaking to some of the commitments that they had made in relation to, particularly the last point, announcing a series of other actions related to transportation, trade, tourism, and environmental protection. So this is the one that encompasses the resolution that was adopted, and I'll get into a little bit of detail about what the resolution is. But the important part is that it really lays out for the law committee and also for policy program areas a commitment in the future to work towards some of these items that have been identified in the resolution. So the resolution includes, we spoke earlier about where possible, it's really ideal to have consistent regulations and harmonizing them where that may be effective or possible to address regulatory gaps. One of the items that is contained in the resolution speaks to expanding the least wanted invasive species list. Right now that consists of 16 species. And in the future, obviously, there will be some work towards what can we add to that? What are the emerging threats that should maybe be addressed by adding them to a least wanted list? The other aspect of the resolution includes expanding an initiative that Ontario, Michigan, and Ohio have been participating in. So it's a harmonization initiative that's, I think, been ongoing since 2013. Is that correct? Yeah. So doing some work to see if that can be expanded. I think a lot of that work will be sitting with the policy areas, and I believe the Aquatic Invasive Species Task Force, who are also involved with the next item. So the resolution also states that within 2 years, the Law Enforcement Committee and the Governors and Premiers Task Force, Aquatic Nuisance Task Force, will develop a regional model framework to support consistent approaches to AIS prevention and enforcement throughout the basin. To be honest, we don't have a clear idea yet what that means, but this is one of the items that the Law Committee will be working on in terms of scoping it and trying to understand where this may move in the future. And clearly it's a priority, because if we need to have something in 2 years, it's something we're going to start working on now. The other aspect of the resolution speaks to an existing memorandum of understanding. So there's currently a memorandum of understanding around regional cooperative enforcement operations that at the time has 5 parties involved in it already. It includes not only the first piece on shared enforcement operations, but also information sharing and the other aspect of developing consistent and routine reporting processes. At the time, the Memorandum of Understanding, it currently includes Michigan, Ontario, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, Minnesota, Ohio, New York, and Environment Canada. and I believe 2 other parties have been added since then. But the key thing being here, this is an existing tool where parties can be added to it as long as they agree with the terms and conditions that are outlined in it. A little bit more information on the resolution, what it may mean in terms of the Law Enforcement Committee. There is a bullet point on expanding training opportunities, and really what this is around is making sure that law enforcement personnel are kept up to date on any technologies that could be used, and training that may help them in identifying and following aquatic invasive species and the offenders that don't follow the laws. The training piece is something that the Law Enforcement Committee has already provided in part as part of its standing agenda. Usually when we have our meetings, there are elements of training that are provided. So the Law Committee basically sees this as another opportunity to follow up on continued education. Another aspect of the resolution is kind of speaks to forming a task team. So there is a recognition that within some jurisdictions it would be probably very helpful and useful to enhance enforcement capacity through an expert group that deals with aquatic invasive species as a focus point. This, of course, will be dependent on the capacity within each jurisdiction to do this. And if you think back to the example of Ontario, you can see that in the past we certainly have had an Asian carp task team. But this is something that the Law Enforcement Committee, through its commitment to the resolution, will try to encourage and support within each of the jurisdictions that are members. So just to summarize, we have a fair amount of work ahead of us in terms of what the Law Committee can support and assist with. In terms of this presentation, one of the take-home messages really is that there was a high risk of Asian carp coming into the Great Lakes Basin that really prompted all the non-federal jurisdictions to bring about their own rules which prohibit importation, exportation, transportation, sales, purchase, and acquisition of live Asian carp. And this really was the saving grace for them when you have things like case law that change the interpretation of rules that are in place. So because of that collective action that was taken, I think we can say that we kept Asian carp out of Ontario, the one jurisdiction that didn't have these fish. Really sort of the summary of this story is that just because you may be successful in, influencing rules at a federal level, it doesn't necessarily mean you should give up on working on your own rules and continually improving. So for the Law Enforcement Committee, the path forward will be a main focus this year to work on the development of the different items under the resolution, but also coming up with some mechanisms to show that we have actually made a difference in terms of some performance measures. So how is the work that we're doing now enhancing what we already have in place? And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to address them.
Thank you, Brenda. That was great. So while we, I guess I don't have the last slide. While we wait for some questions, I have a few here. I was wondering what the biggest enforcement challenge in Ontario is.
In terms of keeping Asian carp out of the province?
Yes.
Or in, okay. So that's an interesting question. And we've been working on actually developing an action plan and maybe just tell you a little bit about what we've done in the past in terms of setting priorities. So in the past, enforcement branch had a slightly different process for setting priorities, where we had identified a number of priorities. I think we had 17 provincial priorities. One of the things we recognized is that those are too many priorities to really focus in. So what's changed over the last couple of years is that we have modified our approach to basically risk assessment and looking at what activities we would focus in on. One of the ones that we have identified and we have been pursuing is looking at aquatic invasive species and trying to prevent their spread. That has different elements to it. And to try to answer your question, around Asian carp coming into Ontario, one of the things I have heard is that there are some difficulties in terms of being able to do inspections at some of the borders. And I obviously welcome any commentary from my colleagues here in the room, but that's one thing that's come through loud and clear. Where we've been, I think, quite fortunate is that the rules that prohibit some of these things from coming in have federal connections. And because of that, places or agencies like the Canadian Border Services agencies have an interest in participating in our work with them to keep them out of the province. Where that starts to maybe fall apart a little bit for us is now where we have our own provincial act, the Invasive Species Act. Because it is provincial, we don't have the same capability to develop partnerships at the borders because of the different agencies that are involved. So that's one aspect that's a challenge. In terms of other aspects, I think there is a large bit of a barrier in terms of, figuring out who's actually engaged in the activity. And maybe by way of example, this might be easier to illustrate, but certainly we have food fish markets in Ontario that are selling fish. They may or may not be doing that without the authority of a license. Where a license is required, we know who's engaged. So we know on the ground, who are the entities. We can have some ability to locate them. Where that becomes a bit more difficult is if they're not needing an authorization, and then we need to start looking for them. So there's an ongoing effort right now that contributes a significant portion of our staff resources to identifying who may be engaged in these activities. So expanding our realm of understanding to not only food fish markets, but places like pet stores or water garden centers that are now, because of our new act, additionally regulated. Would you add anything, Nancy?
Just the pathway for live bait, importation and lack of regulations for live bait.
Yeah. So my colleague, did you hear what Nancy was saying about live bait?
Yes.
That's everything I can think of.
Okay.
Awesome. We have a question from Leslie Wood. She's wondering if the booklets on identification of Asian carp species in the live bait industry from Ohio can be purchased or acquired in Ontario somehow.
Yes, and I'm hoping that Jeff Collingwood is still on the line. He's our enforcement representative from Ohio, but I understand he probably can't answer over the phone.
No.
So I can maybe try to follow up and find out if that's available.
Yeah, for sure. That's something that we could do for sure. Another question is, you mentioned that the convictions and the fines from 2005 to 2013, I believe. Do you know if you're seeing a decrease or an increase in fines or anything like that since 2013 until present?
No, so I think that we have not seen that, and Nancy Gullidge is confirming that for me here. And I imagine part of that is a little bit of a change in our approach to
framework.
to monitoring for it, but also the concomitant change in the rule around dead and eviscerated versus just dead.
Great. We actually had not a question but a comment from Julia Combe. She says that there will be an Ontario Baitfish primer release soon. She's saying hopefully January. So that kind of answers Leslie's question a bit. But I think that might be all the questions we have. So thank you again, Brenda, for taking the time to speak to us today. It was really informative and it was a great presentation. And thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. I mentioned before that the webinar will be posted on our website at www.asiancarp.ca, and I'll hopefully get that up online tomorrow. So thanks again for listening, and stay tuned for some future Asian Carp webinars.
Thank you very much for everybody's attention. Bye now.